Well, today we're going to be looking at imposter syndrome and leadership and how you overcome the fear of being found out. But first of all, we ought to find out what imposter syndrome is. So, Catherine, give us your view of imposter syndrome.
So imposter syndrome is something that we talk about a lot and possibly get it incorrect. Often say, I feel a real imposter in this, or I've got imposter syndrome. And that might just be that fleeting feeling of being found out or not good enough. And someone is going to think, why on earth, if they picked me to do that, for example. But when somebody really struggles with constant self-doubt, lack of confident, and it stops them getting involved in things, that's where we would really call this an imposter syndrome. The great thing is, it is just how we feel. It is our perception, and we can overcome it. So it's not a disability. It's not an illness that somebody has, often referred to, as a phenomenon. It's not a real thing, in fact. But we talk about it a lot, and it's in leadership, in the media, about how people are struggling in the workplace. That's when we often use that term, imposter syndrome.
Ian, how often do you see it amongst your clients?
Well, it's quite common. Interestingly, when I was asked to contribute to this podcast, I suffered with a little bit of imposter syndrome because I immediately said yes to it. But then about an hour afterwards, there's a little voice in my head which is saying, well, why did you agree to do that? Because there must be people out there who are more qualified to talk on this than you. But suddenly here I am, feeling slightly overwhelmed, slightly out of my depth. So the first thing about imposter syndrome for me, certainly when I'm working with coaches, is to know that it's a false belief in your head that you're not good enough. It feels very uncomfortable. When you coach somebody who has imposter syndrome, you'll generally find out they're working long hours, catastrophizing, trying to prove themselves to others, seeking validation, and often putting off decisions until they have more information. There's a lot of fear of making mistakes, suffering setbacks, and the worst one is being exposed as a fraud. So that's really what imposter syndrome is all about. It affects high achievers most because they have unrealistically high expectations for themselves. They like to be seen as an expert at all times, and that's actually not realistic in a modern setting when environments are very, very fast moving and you can't be expert at everything.
I often see it amongst younger leaders who have, and by definition, high achievers are often young people because they've had to get there quicker than anybody else. And they do worry about the lack of underpinning experience. How do you coach for that then, Catherine?
I think coaching where somebody but doesn't have that belief that they are good enough arises most when they don't see many role models around them. So it might be a female leader, it might be a young leader, because actually they're there first. And I think one of the things as a coach we can do is get them to really think about where is that coming from and what's the evidence that's causing you to think that. Because as I said earlier, it's a perception. So if we can help the person to rationalize it, to reframe it in a different way, what is it that you are being successful at? What are the things you're doing that are working well? What's the feedback that you're consistently getting that's very supportive of what you're doing? So the reframe and a different rationalization of the reasons that they're giving for why they're not good enough is what is really helpful to do as a coach.
Ian, anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree with everything Catherine said there. There's something around younger people, certainly, when they get into senior positions, that they're used to being top in school, top in college, being told that they're great by everybody, and quite often having a strong parental influence around achievement, which can absolutely blow your game when you're faced with something which is going to stretch you. So being aware of that context sometimes helps the person forgive themselves a little bit and be a little bit more of a friend to themselves.
So I quite often find that people from my kind of ethnic minority are so used to studying things, and it's almost like an engineering mindset. If we get precision into the whole decision-making process through real knowledge, real research, then we can come up with a formula to solve any particular issue that we're dealing with. And it can then develop amongst older chief executives who have got the handles on the levers of power and also the money to commission, for example, huge studies in consultancy. And they end up with the consultant's report coming in sometimes months later, when actually the whole opportunity has moved on and they've missed the boat. The opportunity is gone. And I'm wondering whether there's this coaching opportunity with younger leaders to get them to understand that certainty is not always an option, because we live in such uncertain times. And there's this VUCA acronym, which we all hear about. Catherine, what would you say about that?
Coming back to something Ian said earlier about, I think if you notice somebody is putting off making decisions or a lot of delay tactics, I think that is trying to help them say, sometimes we have to take a risk. We have to move on with something. We can't have that consistency and that constant that perhaps we're used to. The more senior you become, the more you are expected to make those decisions, perhaps sometimes have to be quite spontaneous, thought through decision, but not have all the information. And I think one of the things that probably drove more people to talk about imposter syndrome was the, effect of COVID, where suddenly nobody had been there before and leaders were needing to make decisions on things that we had no experience of. And I suspect there were many people who really felt that imposter syndrome in those years that we were going through that. When things are new and uncertain, you would hope that those experiences have really given people a resilience around making decisions through uncertainty. But there'll be people who weren't making decisions through COVID and are now experiencing that. So absolutely, I think uncertainty, change, suddenly being responsible for, a lot more things when you're promoted creates a real drive for that anxiety and think, oh my goodness, can I actually do this?
Ian, anything to add?
Yeah, I think certainly when you're younger in your career and you get your first big job, what you really don't like is fear, uncertainty, doubt, and ambiguity. And unfortunately now there's a lot of this about. So there's something around the environment that can be fostered, I think, within an organization to make people more comfortable making decisions with less information. It becomes a lot easier when you have more experience and you can use your gut instinct based on experiences that you've had before. When you're younger, though, it feels sometimes reckless to make that decision. And that's sometimes what freezes people and puts them into imposter syndrome.
So how can organizations provide the right kind of support? I mean, coaching helps, of course, but in the end, it's the day-to-day interactions that people have.
So talking circles or listening circles are really useful in the environment, or just creating an environment where people are encouraged to talk. I think if people start saying, I'm feeling quite anxious about this, just naming this feeling, recognizing you're not on your own and getting that support. So helping people recognize, first of all, that someone's doubting themselves and putting themselves down constantly and not recognizing how far they've come. Colleagues need to recognize that and help each other, give that support. So we need to create that environment where people can speak up, but also where the support's available. And these sort of informal talking circles, listening circles, different companies call them, can be a really useful intervention for that.
And perhaps people who are senior to the emerging leaders need to do a lot more of yes and as opposed to yes but. That's quite tough sometimes to remember that it's so easy to crush somebody's spirit, particularly if they're feeling vulnerable, by imprecise use of language or loose use of language. Ian, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think that, it does come to the leader to actually encourage and do the yes and to provide praise, especially if somebody's given discretionary effort. They've tried something new, they've experimented, they may have made an error, or they may have contributed something in a meeting, and to be met with ridicule, for example, or some type of negative effect can stop them from doing so in future. So I think you need to be very, very careful about how you treat people. Coming back to Catherine's point, talking circles or action learning sets, mentoring, of course. We're seeing increasingly mentoring programs coming in whereby you have somebody who you can confidentially share your challenges with, who's at or above your level. Very, very useful. Gold standard, of course, and we would say this, is coaching. So companies like Aziz can provide a coach who can help that person become a better observer of themselves in terms of the language and stories in their head, the emotions that are accompanying that, and even the body, the posture that you're adopting when you're communicating. So these can really contribute to somebody if they want to make a step change in how they're feeling around their leadership act, a step change which is going to be sustainable rather than just in the moment.
And fundamentally, coaching is nothing else. Holding up a mirror to someone and saying, this is how you are, and reflecting that back to them. Have you thought about this? And I mean, every now and again, one gets an indication we might be getting something right when someone says to you, gosh, you know me so well. Of course, we only see them for a couple of hours at a time. But you know, because we're very much on their side and we want them to succeed, it's always a question of being direct. But they can take that, and they often, I find, I don't know whether you find the same, but people are surprised at how apparently perceptive we seem to be. But that's because we're not coming at it with all the baggage that can necessarily come from an internal situation in any particular business. What's your feeling on this, Catherine?
I think coaching also allows the other person to do that reflection and work out for themselves how they can develop and move through this. Because the last thing they need is somebody, either their coach or senior manager, telling them, oh, do you not think you could do it this way? Or here's an idea, because that immediately adds to this imposter syndrome of, I should have thought of that. I feel really stupid now. So the coaching absolutely encourages them, builds their self-belief, and therefore, the way to reframe it.
Yes, we really want the people we're coaching to go away and say, you really made me think about that, because that means that they are taking it on. We've only got a few minutes left. I'd like us to come up with a few things directly, and perhaps for somebody who might be listening to this and thinking themselves a bit insecure, they might have a bit of imposter syndrome. What strategies could we give them? Just simple pieces of advice. Let's start with you, Ian. A couple of things, if you have them immediately to hand.
Yeah, so the first thing is become aware of the voice and the stories in your head. Ask if they're true. What evidence do I have for this? Because an awful lot of the nonsense that we carry around in our head, I often think of it like old cassettes that are filling up my glove compartment in my car. They're not needed anymore. They're completely irrelevant, but they're cluttering things up. So coming back to something which you said earlier, many people feel that they're not enough. They need more techniques, more skills, more of this, more of that. Coaching, really, and the mindset is that you are already enough, but you're ruining your game with the stories in your head. So first of all, become aware of it, and to Catherine's point, reframe them into something positive, which is going to serve you better. Second thing is get some support. Get a coach, get a mentor, share what you're feeling. I tend to find that most people are left to their own devices nowadays, their own individual resilience, rather than having some support in place. So although well-being is spoken about a lot, certainly with global companies, the feeling that I get is there's a very, very high demand on people to achieve at a high level without any support. So get yourself some support, and thereby you can share what you're feeling and get a different perspective on it. That would be my thought.
Catherine?
I think building on that reflection with a coach, I would encourage someone to journal and to notice, be your best observer, your chief champion, and journal the things that you are doing and doing well and the progress you're making. Because we so often pick the thing, when someone's, how are you? Oh, it's not going so well. Or that was a great presentation you just did. Oh, but I went over the time. We're too critical of ourselves. So journal the good stuff and use it to look back on, see your own positive story. And the other thing, I think social media has added to imposter syndrome enormously. So stop looking at all these key influencers who post on LinkedIn every day, these wonderful stories that are happening. So it's just not realistic. And you're putting these people, you're watching the people who are doing the best and comparing yourself. So find realistic role models. And I think coming back to Ian's point, we are our best role models. So look at ourselves and just refine and tweak and adapt to it. So I'd say stop comparing yourself to those unrealistic role models out there, because we will just be disappointed with what we do ourselves.
Good. So catching yourself doing something right is really important, and building on that is really important. Obviously, you have to be objective and you have to be realistic, but realism is the real thing. And getting things into context. We tend to focus on the negatives rather than the positives. And you wouldn't be where you are today without being pretty positive with much of the decision making you've taken. Well, that's really helpful. Thank you both, Ian and Catherine. Obviously, if anybody's got anything to contribute, having listened to this, we're always very keen to hear your feedback. Just write to kate@azizcorp.com and say what you have to say. And hopefully this will be one of a series of podcasts as we go on, and we'll perhaps pick this subject up again. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.